When we think about populist leaders in general, in today's political world or at any time over the course of the last century, we almost always imagine some standalone dude promising to fix all of his countrymen's problems with one giant sweep of the hand. Very rarely do we think about the populist wives, or at least not as a significant political actor. But there's one fantastic exception to this rule, and it refers to, incidentally, to the phenomenon that inspired academic study of populism in the first place. I'm talking about none other than Argentina's Juan and Eva Perón, perhaps the most celebrated power couple in modern history. So who are they? And what explains their rise to power? And what legacy have they left for Argentine politics long after they were dead and gone? Let's talk about it. But first...
Don't cry for me, Argentina. The truth is I never left you. All through my wild days, my mad existence, I kept my promise. Don't keep your distance.
Juan Domingo Perón was elected president in Argentina in 1946, served until 1955 when he was overthrown in a military coup and exiled to Spain, and then came back to Argentina to win the presidency one last time in 1973, only to die of natural causes 8 months later. Eva Duarte Perón, his second wife, was Argentina's first lady during Perón's first term and part of his second, but then she died in 1952 at the age of 33. Wow. That's the most uninteresting way to describe the most celebrated power couple in modern history. So let me try that again. Juan and Eva Perón, together as a couple, electrified millions of Argentines in the mid-20th century with their charisma, charm, and expert politicking. And in so doing, they engendered a massive and almost religiously loyal political following that continues to profoundly impact the way politics is done in Argentina even today, more than 70 years later. In effect, they became living gods in their own time. And now, long after their death, their place in the pantheon of Argentine national deities remains steadfast and meaningful. The cultish obsession with them has been so great that Juan Perón's corpse has even been stolen several times over the years. And our beloved Evita, even as late as 2010, giant images of her were being erected in buildings in Buenos Aires in an attempt to evoke her soul or something of the sort. So who were these people in real life? Well, prior to becoming a living god, Juan Perón was a military man, eventually an army general, who had mixed feelings about both liberal democracy and fascism, as it were. But most of all, he loved power. He was appointed to the Secretariat of Labor by a military government in 1943 at the height of the Second World War, and he used this position to begin building a loyal following among the country's labor unions, which would later help him win the presidency just 3 years afterwards in 1946. Eva Duarte, meanwhile, who changed her name to Eva Perón after they married in 1945, well, she was a working class girl who always wanted to be an actress. And this was at a time when being an actress was widely considered to be just one step up from being a prostitute. And this is important because the marriage of an elite military man and a presidential candidate to a lowly aspiring actress was, to put it bluntly, a smack in the face of the bourgeois social norms of the day. And the working classes, of course, well, they loved the hell out of that.
Don't cry for me, Argentina. The truth is I never left you.
But what explains Juan and Eva Perón's meteoric rise to power? It's probably best to start by looking at the social and economic changes in Argentina in the early to mid-20th century. Going back to the early 1900s, Argentina was, interestingly, one of the wealthiest countries on earth. And this was thanks to a wondrous combination of having extensive grasslands, really fat, nice cows, but also the invention of steam-powered cargo ships. That is, Argentina got really rich by selling the world really good beef.
Don't cry for me, Argentina.
And this was at a time when Europe had lots of really pressing problems: deep poverty, plagues, overpopulation, devastating wars, and other such political turmoil, such that huge numbers of poor Europeans were fleeing Europe, mostly from Italy, Spain, and Germany at the time, and they immigrated to Argentina during the first decades of the century. And they flooded into Argentina's cities, especially the capital, Buenos Aires, which saw its urban working class multiply many times over, precisely at the time when political leaders at the time were incentivizing industrial growth as a central component to their economic policies. However, since Argentina got rich on selling beef, real political power had been concentrated into the hands of a mostly rural oligarchy, in conjunction with a rich merchant class that controlled export markets. And for such elites, democracy really meant oligarchy, and there was little interest or concern for including the rapidly growing working class population into their deliberations about how to run the country. And this is where our power couple come into play. When he took over as Secretary of Labor in 1943, Juan Perón realized that he could harness this massive potential power of organized labor by positioning himself as a political renegade, fighting against the elites of the government and fighting for the rights and well-being of the working class. And so he used this power within the government to win contracts between certain labor unions and industry that would end up increasing workers' pay and benefits, decreasing their work week hours, and improve overall working conditions. Eva, meanwhile, employed her charismatic actress skills and her working-class identity to cull supporters and also to lend credibility and legitimacy to Juan Perón's pro-working-class stance. Of course, there was no shortage of politicking here, too. Juan Perón made sure to punish and exclude any labor union that refused to pledge loyalty to him personally. In any case, by 1946, when he ran for president, his strategic pro-labor strategy had come to fruition, and he won the presidency with just over 52% of the national vote. Now, in the following 2 to 3 years, moreover, organized labor saw dramatic increases in their average income, pay, and benefits, something like 25% wage increases across the board, and significantly greater increases in certain industries. And much of these improvements were the direct result of government-assisted negotiations between unions and industrial elites, even if indirectly they were only possible because of the early post-World War II export boom in Argentina. Naturally, in any case, Juan and Eva made sure to take full credit, and their followers grew increasingly loyal to them. But of course, nothing good lasts forever, right? By the late 1940s, the post-war export boom had died away, and suddenly the high wages of the Argentine working class, and also the government subsidies of industry, the price controls on food, and many other populist government interventions under Perón, well, they could no longer be sustained. Perón's government responded to this by printing more money. And, well, you know what that leads to. Inflation. Now, economically, things had gotten bad by the end of the 1940s. But Juan and Eva, charismatic as ever, they were able to win re-election in 1950 relatively easily. Juan continued rewarding the labor unions while making expert use of the new trend in home television ownership to craft sensational propaganda and inject his heroic image into millions of households across the country. Eva ran a charity foundation that solved the problems of the poor in a tangible, immediate kind of way. And she also founded a separate Peronista political party just for women, capitalizing on women's voter enfranchisement, which she and her husband helped push through Congress in 1947.
Y se lo digo con mi pasión de peronista y de mujer, que el peronismo que nació el 17 de octubre es una victoria del auténtico pueblo sobre la oligarquía.
Now together, Juan and Eva made emotionally charged televised speeches before roaring crowds of hundreds of thousands of people. They were making their mark on Argentine political society in a new and profound way. Now, 2 years later, in 1952, Eva Perón discovered she had cancer and she was dying, but this didn't stop her from campaigning on behalf of her husband. At this point, the Argentine economy had started to collapse, and it would have been wise for the country to reconsider its economic policies under Perón, but the image of a sickly and fragile Evita standing upright and strong in front of an adoring mass of people to proclaim the virtues of her husband and also the evils of the oligarchy, well, this was enough to immortalize them both in the pantheon of Argentine deities forever. Juan Perón's government may have been driving the economy right into the ground, but that didn't matter for at least roughly 1/3 of the Argentine population for whom they had become essentially gods. And roughly 1/3 of any country can have a profound impact on politics, of course, especially if they stay true to their beliefs from one generation to the next. And this has, since the 1950s, been the case of Argentina. As I mentioned earlier, Juan Perón, alone now that his wife had passed away, was overthrown in a military coup in 1955, and he went into exile to Spain. And the new military regime did everything it could to erase Peronismo from Argentine political society. They banned the Peronista party itself, they banned Peronista symbols, and they even tried to ban people from talking about Juan and Eva Perón at all. But you can't kill an idea now, can you? At least not very easily. And sometimes the harder you try to kill an idea, the more life you breathe right back into it. This whole process took a while, nearly 2 decades, in fact. But by the early 1970s, the Argentine military regime realized, with utter dismay, of course, that they simply could not erase the legacy of Juan and Eva Perón. Moreover, since Juan was still alive and stoking the fires of political conflict from his outpost in Spain at this time, the regime ultimately felt they had no choice but to relent, and in hopes that the real Juan Perón, who was now a bit old and decrepit, might undermine the idea of Juan Perón if he were to actually be allowed to return to the country and run for president again. So, in 1973, Juan Perón did come back to Argentina with his new wife, Isabel Perón, or Isabelita as they called her in an effort to conjure up the spirit of the dead Evita, and he won the election. The military regime calculated poorly, I guess, but the military was right about one thing. The real Juan Perón wasn't going to deliver on his promises like he had done as a younger man. In fact, he up and died just 8 months after taking office. And what followed was a veritable shitstorm of a decade. As it turned out, Perón's populism culled fanatically loyal and violent support from both the revolutionary right and the reactionary left. And well, the two sides went to war with each other as soon as he took power. He ended up siding with the right, which then established control of the country's security apparatus after the time of his death. And after his death, his new wife, Isabelita, became Argentina's first female president. But she didn't actually rule the country. Instead, the right-wing security apparatus did. And this led to the beginning of what today is now known as Argentina's Dirty War, a period of about 10 years during which upwards of 30,000 people were tortured, killed, or otherwise disappeared.
Soy dueño de mi destino, de todos mis sueños y mi libertad. Me siento hermano del viento y si un niño llora me pongo a llorar. Me siento hermano del viento y si un niño llora me pongo a llorar.
Now, Argentina has basically been democratic again since the mid-1980s, and there haven't been any more excessively violent periods since the end of that dirty war. However, democracy in Argentina hasn't exactly been stable, but instead has lived through crisis after crisis. And this, incidentally, has a lot to do with the legacy of that great power couple, Juan and Eva Perón. Still to this day, the Justicialista party, which Juan Perón created in 1946, still bases its legitimacy in its founding figure and repeatedly conjures up the spirit of Eva Perón in order to get their voter base feeling emotionally linked to their cause. Juan and Eva are depicted as the firm and loving mother and father of the real Argentina, and voting for any other party is understood as voting against Argentina. 70 years after the death of Evita, and nearly 50 years after Juan's death, this psychic strategy still wins national elections, despite the Justicialista parties presiding over verifiably terrible economic outcomes over and over again. So, what has been the legacy of the world's most celebrated power couple? From this vantage point, it is an almost religious fanaticism that dominates political contestation decades on in Argentina, and at the expense of both institutional and economic stability. But of course, there's always more to the story. The legacy of Juan and Eva Perón is also one in which the disenfranchised masses were ushered into a political system as protagonists for the very first time in history. A sort of popular sovereignty, if you will. And that is certainly important for democracy. But what do you think? I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Populism and Democracy in the Americas Online.